Powerless without my PowerPoint. Okay, so welcome back. This is Legal Studies 160, Punishment, Culture, and Society. You may be confused as to why, but this is, unless you've been following this very carefully, this is Lecture 13, Capital Punishment in Asia. Last Thursday, there was no class for people listening online because students here were having a midterm, which I know they enjoyed. The good thing about the midterm is you now kind of know the drill for the exam part of this course, because the final will be not an exact replica, but the same kind of drill for the material beginning essentially today for the rest of the course. Therefore, you kind of know what to pay attention to in the reading and in lecture. Hopefully, again, the exam is mainly designed to make sure that you're getting some content and value out of the readings and lecture. The more interesting, I think, from at least my point of view, assignment is now coming up, which is the paper. And one of the good things about having the midterm out of the way is we can start talking more about the paper. And even as I talk about the capital punishment in Asia segment today, I want to start, again, planning a little bit more, some more seeds about possible paper topics and what's a good scale for a paper topic. So if I leave you with more questions, feel free to ask me some, and I'll try to leave some time at the end of class. A couple of announcements. One thing, there's a very interesting sort of, as we're beginning to shift from the death penalty to thinking about incarceration and eventually mass incarceration, very important opportunity, very important to avail yourself when it is available to hear the voices of people who have been incarcerated. Because you can hear a lot from me about what incarceration does, what drives it, etc. I've spent a few nights in jail, but I have not been mass incarcerated by any stretch of the imagination. But there's a lot of people in the state that have, and a very articulate person who's experienced this and who, at a very young age, Eddie Zhang, who's been sort of an anti-incarceration activist and social justice activist since his release, 2 years ago now, 3 years ago? So Eddie he's written an interesting memoir, and he speaks a lot about his experiences in prison, the crimes that took him to prison, how he thinks about restorative justice and other issues today. What are the details on the talk? He's going to be at Berkeley Law this week?
Yeah, it'll be tomorrow, Wednesday, March 7th, 12:45 to 1:45 in room 141. And he's going to be talking about criminal justice system, anti-oppression, and seeking alternatives to violence. So that's all the details. And he's also going to be sharing some of his spoken word poetry.
Great. So yeah, I've heard him speak before, and he's extremely interesting and engaging. So as we begin to think about imprisonment, that would be an excellent opportunity. So also to report back briefly, while you guys were, this is really going to add insult to injury, while you were taking your midterm exam, I was down in San Jose at a symposium on David Garland's important book that I've discussed with you, The Peculiar Institution, America's Death Penalty in the Age of Abolition. And we had a pretty interesting forum about the book, and it was obviously very apropos our own, what we've been studying recently. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things as sort of a transition to today's topic, because one of the things that came up in the debate between myself, Garland, Mona Lynch, who's a professor at UC Irvine, whose work we'll look at later in the term, Alexander DeGiorgi, who's a professor there at San Jose State, and Andy Love, who's an attorney here who represents death row inmates, started talking about the sort of regional aspects of the death penalty. And obviously there are different scales of regions. Asia is one kind of region, the American South or the West is another kind of region. But in the world we live in and have lived in since the 19th century, the death penalty is no longer a universal, right? One of the things that made the world before, say 1820 or 30 or so unique or different, very different from ours, is that the death penalty is close to what we might call a cultural universal. And anthropologists used to think that there were a lot of these, and now they're not certain there are all that many of them. These are things that basically show up in every culture without variation across time. Not that they don't vary in how they're practiced, etc. But that it's essentially universal. It shows up everywhere. After 1830, it begins to become a much more contested domain. And of course, today, within certain regions of the world, like Europe, it's virtually completely disappeared, or Latin America, etc. And of course, America's experience has gone through both phases of this. In the world of, say, 1930, 1940, the death penalty is practically universal in the United States. There's only a handful of states that abolished in the 19th century, or one maybe at the very beginning of the 20th century. There may have been 4 or 5 abolitionist states, but the rest of the country not only had the death penalty, but used it, and not just in states of the South. It was used as a punishment for serious murders and other serious crimes like kidnapping and robbery in a lot of states. After 1972 and the Furman to Gregg moratorium, legal moratorium, the new death penalty, the kind of pet cemetery death penalty as I've described it, that we kind of came back but not quite the same, is no longer anything like universal in the United States. It's very regionalized. And what's the meaning of this regionalization? So some of the leading current theorists of the death penalty in the United States have emphasized not only a regional pattern, which is, I think, obvious when you look at the data that's in that DPIC, Death Penalty Information Center pamphlet that was in your reading for the very first week. There's just huge variation in which states execute, and then regions as well. So the South looms large. I mean, well more than half of all executions since the resumption of the death penalty in 1976 have taken place in the South. A handful of states, Texas, Oklahoma, Virginia, account for the vast majority of those. How do we make sense of that pattern? Now, Frank Zimmering, in his 2003 book, The Contradictions of American Capital Punishment, made the interesting empirical finding that one of the best, if not the best, predictor of which states executed people in the 1980s and 90s was which states lynched people in the 1880s and 90s. Now, there's some exceptions to this. Virginia, big executing state now, was not a big lynching state for a variety of interesting reasons. But it's a strong pattern that holds up as you run different kinds of controls. And it's quite different than the pattern of death sentences. That is, we look at what states sentence people to death, you get a very different pattern. In some years, actually, California has sentenced more people to death than a lot of states in the South. But if you look at who gets executed, you get this very southern picture and a deep South picture indeed. David Garland, in his book, makes sort of 3 interesting points about this regionalization. One is the point that our very strong version of federalism, and hopefully some of the legal studies students in the class, their ears perked up with federalism, right? It's our not unique, but fairly distinctive version of it, our constitutional structure in which we have the federal government and then states that have considerable control over their own criminal justice system, education system, etc. Of course, with the federal constitution and federal statutes having supremacy, but leaving lots of room for the states. Garland points out that federalism, which is quite different from the federalisms you'll find in Australia or Canada or Germany, there are other states that have other nations that have sub-state units, but America is a particularly strong version of it, perhaps because they were once virtually nations, and the Articles of Confederation gave them great powers that they lost then in the constitution process. So Garland points out that the very existence of this strong federalism is one of the reasons you get states in the 19th century that abolished the death penalty. So in Europe, where there's no state, I think there's 1 or 2 states, that is a decision that could only be made by the national government. And only when that national elite was ready to give up the death penalty could you imagine the death penalty going. But in the United States, because of our federal system, where you had strong kind of moral movements against the death penalty in the 19th century, usually in some ways our federalism is the reason we had abolition early on. But the other side of that is it's the reason we have so much more of a death penalty today than Europe does. Because in every European system that we talked about, it was essentially the strong power of the national government, bolstered by a shift in political power, usually to the left, but that gets essentially imposes a human rights-oriented abolition platform on national publics that are pro-death penalty and simply don't have anywhere to go. Both parties will tend to usually, if there's party competition, both parties have supported the abolition, etc. America, we don't have that. That is, even if the national government wanted to get rid of the death penalty, and it seemed to actually in the 60s, it really would have a hard time forcing the states to do so unless it had a Supreme Court's imprimatur behind the notion that the death penalty was unconstitutional, which is why Furman was so important to that case. But that means today, the same kind of looseness in our structure that allowed a Michigan to become a death penalty abolitionist state in the middle of the 19th century allows Texas to operate like a mid-range Asian nation in its level of executions, as we'll see in a little bit today, right? Even though our national system looks like we have a very different kind of death penalty. So that heritage of the South is part of a heritage in which we have a strong commitment to federalism. Now, the South wrapped itself in a particularly racialized version of that because so many of the battles about state power versus national power were explicitly about race and race supremacy of white people in the South. But that same kind of federalism plays out in the death penalty in ways that aren't completely captured, even though they often carry messages about those underlying racial conflicts. They also have other conflicts, the conflicts over criminal justice policy, education policy, etc. Now, the second point Garland makes is that the lynching experience that Zimring saw as so important in predicting executions today is a profoundly telling fact about the American cultural comfort with the death penalty. And the lesson he takes from it is that whereas in France and England, where the death penalty is sort of a tool of the king or of a kind of consortium of economic elites that are sheltered under monarchical power, in America from the very beginning, there's a sense of the death penalty as a kind of populist, private vengeance, vigilante tradition. And of course, very much tied up with the post-Civil War repression of the freed slaves given theoretical equality by the federal Constitution in the immediate aftermath of Reconstruction and the whole system, therefore, of segregation and inequality that grows up. Lynching is a key part of that, but it's only a part of a larger tradition of vigilantism. Garland argues that, interestingly, lynching haunts us today in two respects that makes a mark on the death penalty. One is that the death penalty that has come back to us, the sort of pet cemetery version of it after near extinction at the hands of the court, is one whose very shape and style appears to be in some ways as if it was designed to not be a lynching. That is, if you look at the way people are executed, how they get to the execution stage by going through these trials, these seemingly endless appeals, and you ask yourself, what's the meaning? Why did they build this really weird contraption? They were trying to kill people in an effective way. This is not a very efficient machine for doing so. What is it a machine for? Well, it's a machine for killing people in a way that nobody can claim is a lynching, because the whole system seems designed to at least damp down the suspicion that it is a lynching, right? No lynching ever involved appointing extra lawyers for the lynch victim, right? Or a set of appeals for the lynch victim. No lynching system ever depended on making the lynching as painless as possible, right? Just the opposite. So there's this way in which the lynching is a negative example against which, if we're going to have a death penalty, it has to prove itself to not be lynching, which leaves a considerable vulnerability to the death penalty. To the extent that we see it as continuing to have elements of lynching, it risks significant delegitimation. But the other side of that for Garland is that when you look at that regional pattern, here he comes back to Zimring's point, some of that commitment for private justice, and especially the racialized quality that it took in the South, helps explain the persistence of the death penalty and its frequency in the South. Both Mona Lynch and I wanted to just add an addendum to that, and it's one that I think may be of interest to some of you who are interested in writing papers on the death penalty, and that is, post-Furman, or during the conflict that led to Furman and the subsequent case law, the death penalty in America was in many ways framed as a Southern institution, and abolition was framed as part of the civil rights agenda. There was certainly great truth to that, but it also covered up some things. And one of the things it covered up is that there were different traditions of the death penalty in America. And one of the things that both Mona, who's written a terrific book on Arizona's penal system called, is it dry justice or tough justice, cheap justice, something like that, that fits Arizona very well, climatologically at least, it is her title, Mona Lynch. It's about the prison system, but she's also talking about the larger culture of punishment in Arizona. And I was thinking more about California, but both of us sort of made the case to Garland that he was overlooking the strength of what we might call the Western death penalty. And there's a kind of Western vigilante tradition, right? Some of you have heard about the commissions, the Committee of Vigilance in San Francisco in 1851 and 1856 that carried out essentially lynchings, but highly legalistic ones in which people were put in kind of full-scale mock trials and executed in a very formal way in the name of imposing the rule of law. In San Jose in 1933, there was a lynching of two kidnapped murderers who had kidnapped and murdered a man named Bret Hart, who was a San Francisco department store heir, basically, and a student at San Jose State, as a matter of fact. They murdered him, and they were caught soon thereafter. And I believe it was in October 1933, basically the radio stations in the Bay Area sort of had a frenzy about this case and called on people to come out to San Jose and lynch these people, and they did. There was a lynching in 1933 right here in downtown San Jose. And it's striking because it's not a racialized lynching. Bret Hart is actually a Jewish American. The two kidnappers were of German origin. And indeed, the Nazis actually made a propaganda movie about their lynching to kind of document the barbaric quality of American justice. A little bit tough sell, perhaps, for us in retrospect. But you can see that this did not stand out to them as an example of sort of American racism. It's rather as an example of American barbarism, which they focused on. Long and the short of it. There's a case to be made that there's a Western death penalty, which, while not untainted by the racism of the Southern death penalty, has its origins also in the incredible anxiety associated with Western settlement, and the degree to which settlement extended well beyond the reaches of government, formal government in many respects. And this kind of Western posse comitatus sort of tradition, which you see echoes of in the modern Tea Party movement and other things, continues to sort of resonate in California's voter initiatives and the idea that justice has to have a strong taint of, or taste of populist sentiment in it. Now, when I say that here's an interesting example, well, if one wanted to tease out that thesis, that the Western death penalty is something a bit different and that it plays a role in the maintenance of America's death penalty, it would be very interesting, for instance, write a paper about the very first initiative to put the death penalty back in California law that took place before, that responded to the decision by the California Supreme Court striking down the death penalty even before Furman, a few months earlier. And we noted in Gregg that the Supreme Court actually reported the results of that initiative as a good example of the rejection of the claim that the death penalty was no longer compatible with value. So that initiative campaign, which there's certainly a lot of documentary sources on, newspapers, etc., would be a very interesting moment to say, is there evidence here of a kind of distinctive Western sensibility about the death penalty that in some ways can distinguish it from the South? Is it more concerned about sort of crime in a kind of addressed to lawlessness as opposed to a kind of racial threat hypothesis? And the argument that I ultimately am interested in exploring in my own work is that the Western death penalty, at least as it's come to be evolved in California, is much more committed to death sentences than it is to executions. Because if the real core of the Western death penalty is a certain kind of fear of crime combined with a mistrust of the state, rather than a deeply racialized and racist need to kind of use terror against a whole population that you think might uprise against you, right? Then you might expect that death sentences, which really mean, in effect, in California, life without parole, and we really mean it, you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison and you're going to die in prison, is not a dysfunctional death penalty. It may be what actually the Western death penalty evolves toward. Now, Arizona is an interesting counter theory to mine because they execute a lot of people there. And so somebody might want to write on Arizona's death penalty. And again, just to say a little bit about the scale of paper topics, you generally don't want to write on the Arizona death penalty, or for that matter, especially not, say, the Taiwanese death penalty or the South Korean death penalty, a whole nation's experience. What you might want to look at is a particular court case, a particular execution that was controversial or not, and use that kind of event to try to tease out or explore some of these themes. And I hope I can flesh that out a little bit more. Now, I want to turn to the announced topic of today, but if I raise any questions about sort of the death penalty in the South or the West, I'm going to move from the United States now very decidedly, so I'd be happy to take them. Okay, so the good news here is that you've only read a tiny bit about a fascinating topic, and I heartily recommend, this is from the article you read, but Zimmering and Johnson have a whole book, and I recommended some chapters of that. This is, if you're interested in the death penalty and its future today, as they say, there can be no place more interesting than Asia. If abolition takes hold in Asia, then it truly becomes a universal value. We're very close to it. If it fails to, we end up with a world divided between, say, Europe and Latin America, and maybe or the Americas eventually, if you throw us in, and say the Asia and the Islamic world. It's going to look more bipolar around the death penalty. So Asia is clearly the final frontier in many ways for the battle over the meaning of the death penalty. And it's also an extraordinary opportunity, and that's what I want to use it for today, to visit some of our kind of social cultural theories about why death penalties persist or desist or change. So again, here's the big picture. And again, I'm always unclear what constitutes Asia, but of course, part of Russia is, and now looks green, abolitionist in practice, because Russia is part of the European community, although not the European Union. So we're clearly looking south of Russia. But sort of Eastern Asia, and that's really everything from India and China east, at least for today's purposes, is pretty much red for retentionists. There are some abolitionist countries here and there, and in practice. There's Hong Kong, which is the only Asian jurisdiction I believe is fully abolitionist in de jure, in law. And some people include, this always confuses the hell out of me. I mean, Australia and New Zealand are their own continent, right? Or do they get thrown into Asia too? Asia's big enough. I don't think they need Australia. And Australia is obviously abolitionist, so it would cloud this picture. But if we focus on East Asia, certainly, what we're looking at is what seems like a remarkably retentionist bloc. And it's not just a retentionist bloc in the way that the United States is part of a retentionist bloc. It's a retentionist bloc in the sense that they seem to have held on to a death penalty from well before even the latest, that is, late 20th century battles over complete abolition. That is, they seem to have a death penalty that didn't even go through the kind of partial abolition that we saw was critical in the 19th century, right? I mean, if you take nothing away from our study of the death penalty in Europe and the United States, it should be that most of the ballgame was about partial abolition, and that succeeded almost everywhere in Europe and the United States, where the death penalty was eliminated as the main course in the penal diner, as it were, and was replaced by prison, and the death penalty became a very controlled and limited part of the penal repertoire. That's not so clear in Asia, where in China especially, where again, footnote here, a lot of this is speculative because we don't even know how many people were executed in China. That is very difficult to discern information. Nonetheless, there are some categories of crime, and not only violent crime, in which execution is a regular penal measure in countries like China that can include economic crime. Right? Keep in mind that one of the most common ways to get hanged, not hung, meat is hung, people are hanged. One of the surest ways to get hanged in 18th century England was to coin or mess around with currency, and especially land documents. If you try to fake, if you've seen any of these kind of Jane Austen type miniseries about English life, they get really uptight about property. Who owns property? If you mess with that, you get executed. So, but that's long gone. From about 1860 on in England and across Europe, in Asia you still have that. So they seem to be missing the partial abolition, and they seem to be disobeying. And we never want to disobey Durkheim. One of Durkheim's qualitative laws, which is that, as he puts it, deprivation of liberty and liberty alone, varying in time according to the seriousness of crime, tends to become more and more the normal means of social control. Now, that was obviously a very Eurocentric perspective, to say the least, and that kind of partial abolition that I've been talking about very much forms the background to Durkheim's observation. And I think we might press a little farther in saying that Asia is a kind of outlier on Durkheim's theory about the direction of penal evolution. Not only there's a kind of quantitative and a qualitative dimension to that qualitative or failure to make the qualitative shift that Durkheim was talking about. One is, again, the qualitative dimension, that capital punishment in Europe and the Americas becomes less public and less degrading from the 1800s on. So things like cutting up the body for practice surgery, public displays of the body, as well as painful ways of death, or degrading ways of death, or being killed in front of publics, is pretty much gone in Europe by the end of the 19th century. It's gone outside of the South in the U.S. by the beginning of the 20th century. I think the last public execution is in Kentucky in 1937, rather late. But this persists in Asia, again, until, the Chinese now have moved toward private execution, but there was a considerable period where they did practice public execution, in stadiums often, public execution with shooting, which can, even though it's not a particularly painful way to die, can be viewed as, especially when it's accompanied by a kind of display, people being brought out in a truck and then shot in front of large numbers of people, be considered somewhat degrading. And the frequency with which organs were harvested, both in China and other Asian jurisdictions of capital prisoners, again, raises some of these questions about the qualitative law. Quantitatively, capital punishment becomes less and less frequent and ceases to be a serious crime control measure. And again, while we might find that there's been some change in Asia in the direction of less capital punishment, there was a quote from a Chinese observer in the article by Johnson and Zimmering that the new Chinese policy was kill less and kill more carefully as a kind of policy direction, but that sort of suggests they have a ways to go. So let's think about some of the theories from a social, cultural, and political economic perspective that have tried to explain the European and American pattern of partial abolition to either total abolition or this weird vestigial death penalty that we have in the U.S., but that is shaped to be sort of as minimalized and dignified as possible. We've seen that, broadly speaking, there's sort of three broad accounts of this change. One that we might associate with the Marxist tradition looks at economic development, with the idea that as societies evolve economically, become more advanced and affluent, their elites rely less on sort of terror and mystification to govern the lower orders, and more on more carrots than sticks, more extra vacations and pay raises and retirement funds, and the kind of things that we see in the way of better worker security and benefits in more affluent societies, leading to less reliance on something like the death penalty as a tool of social control. From a sort of political perspective, which we might associate with Foucault's work, we get the notion that as Europe and as the Americas went through the transition to political liberalism, the very role of the death penalty as a sort of conduit of power became less